Thank you very much, commissars, fighters, comrades, the people of South Africa, our comrades in the entire African continent, our progressive forces in the entire African diaspora. Welcome to this presentation, the Digital Political School of the Economic Freedom Fighters. Today we're going to be discussing land expropriation without compensation. So you're all welcome. We're going to respond to some of the questions that have been sent by some of the comrades who have been engaging in this particular process. So we're here today to talk about expropriation of land without compensation. It's a very important discussion in the politics of the economic freedom fighters. But before we do that, it is perhaps important that we should pay tribute to two very important historical figures in our lives. The first one we must pay tribute because today is Easter, it's Good Friday. It's Jesus Christ because Easter represents the death of Jesus Christ, the one who was, is, and is to come. The one who, if we believe that he died and rose from the death, we become saved. But there's an important thing which I think in paying tribute to him we should highlight as we are allowing the others to come to the room. He said when he was teaching about giving that when you give to the poor, don't be like the hypocrites. They blow trumpets in the synagogues and on the street so that the people will see them and honor them. I tell you the truth, these hypocrites already have their full reward. So when you give to the poor, don't let anyone know what you are doing. Your giving should be done in secret. Your Father can see what is done in secret and he will reward you. That is just the tribute that we had to then deal with on this important day of Easter. Then the tribute that we want to pay as well is to Comrade Tembisile Chris Hani. Chris Hani is the only socialist leader who led the African National Congress. The ANC has never been led by a socialist leader at that level like Chris Hani did. He is the most revolutionary of all the leaders that came. And the reason why they killed him in 1993 was because they knew that the agreements which they had reached in CODESA were not going to live forever. They were not going to be permanent if Chris Hani was there, because Chris Hani was uncompromising and he was a socialist to the core. He was a socialist revolutionary fighter, and he said something very instructive in terms of socialism, which we should appreciate, all of us as socialists in the economic freedom fighters. He said socialism is about decent shelter for those who are homeless. It is about water for those who have no safe drinking water. It is about health care. It is about life of dignity for the old. It is about overcoming the huge divide between urban and rural areas. It is about a decent education for all our people. Socialism is about rolling back the tyranny of the market. As long as the economy is dominated by an unelected privileged few, the case for socialism will exist. So we are also inspired by Chris Hani, so we have to pay tribute because on the 10th of April 1993, the apartheid regime, in collaboration with other forces, sent Janus Walus to go and assassinate one of the most formidable leaders in the struggle against apartheid and colonialism. So we pay tribute to Chris Hani and assure him, wherever he is, that we have taken the baton and we are fighting forward towards the attainment of socialist economic freedom in our lifetime. So we can proudly say that we have taken the baton from Chris Tembisile Hani. May his soul rest in peace. Now, comrades, today's presentation is about the land question, and we want to give an important historical overview of where do we come from as South Africa. And I will then make reflections on the ideological question that relates to this. Where are we now? And what are the processes that were engaged in relation to Parliament? Now, what is the problem in terms of the land question? I think one of the apartheid leaders clearly expressed what was the intention of the colonial invaders and settlers when they came into South Africa. So when later on, like P.W. Botha, one of the longest serving prime ministers and presidents of apartheid South Africa, of white people only, once said that I am one of those who believe that there is no permanent home for even a section of the Bantu in the white era of South Africa. And the destiny of South Africa depends on this essential point. If the principle of permanent residence for the black man in the era of the white is accepted, then it is the beginning of the end of civilization as we know it as a country. So the intention of the colonial invaders and settlers and their descendants was to basically expel all Africans in the geopolitical territory called South Africa today. They did not want us here. They utilized their military superiority to kill our people, to defeat our people, and they wanted to take over our land permanently. And that is the problem. And that is the problem that we're dealing with, the problem of landlessness. There is always a mistake that is committed, particularly by leaders of the ruling party now, when they say that the problem of South Africa is inequality, poverty, and starvation. Like they say poverty, inequality, and joblessness. That is what they say are the problems of South Africa. But those are the symptoms. The problem of South Africa is the problem of landlessness. And what does landlessness lead to? To poverty, to unemployment, and to the inequalities that define all of us. So we are now today discussing the problem of South Africa, which is the landlessness of the black majority and Africans in particular. And we'll then give a clearer context in terms of what should happen. So that we give a clear perspective of what we intend to do in terms of this presentation. We want to reaffirm what Frantz Fanon said in The Wretched of the Earth. He said that for a colonized people, the most essential value, because the most concrete, is first and foremost the land which will bring them bread and above all dignity. So that is the intention. I see a lot of people are trying to make presentations about a variety of things, particularly from the other side. And you even struggle to appreciate and understand what they are talking about. But here we're talking about the land question, and which is about giving our people dignity. And then we're going to then deal with all of those aspects there. I know that we've taken a long time, and I think let us be patient with each other, comrades, because we are going to go into clearer context of where do we come from as South Africa. Now, this political territory, the geopolitical territory called South Africa, always had a lot of transatlantic traders. Like the Europeans passed through this part of the world for many centuries before the arrival of Jan van Riebeeck in 1652. So the minimalist history, which most of us, or most of the curriculum exposes to, portrays a picture that Jan van Riebeeck is the first one to touch the geopolitical territory called South Africa from outside of the continent. It's not the case. So there had been transatlantic trade, and a lot of people would stop by the place called Cape Town now and then proceed to the east of the world, which is Indonesia and parts of China and India. So they would come from Europe, take a journey that comes across the entire continent. That was before the creation of the Suez Canal. And they used to travel, and then they used to pass in the Cape, stop, and then proceed. And in some instances, before the arrival of Jan van Riebeeck, they tried to have some trade relations with the Khoi and the San populations that were residing in that particular part of the place we call South Africa today. Now, Jan van Riebeeck was a leader of a ship that came from the Dutch East Indian Company. So the Dutch East Indian Company was a company, like a quasi-colonial company, which was a trading company but had too much power because it had military, it had police, it had huge capacity to could do a lot of things. And then in 1652, instead of just stopping to proceed, Jan van Riebeeck decided to establish a settlement to say that they want to then stay in this part of our world and interact with our nature, with our land and everything else then. And then that is then the beginning of colonialism. That is the beginning of colonial invasion. So it started with just the settlement. They were initially saying they want to put just a garden. Then it became farms. It became the pushing out of the Khoi and the San people out of the land which belongs to our people. And that is what got to define the early invasion of the geopolitical territory called South Africa. And I think all of us know about that. And then at a subsequent stage, the British colony, which was one of the most bullying and the most dominant colonizers in the 15th century, in the 16th century, in the 17th century, in the 18th century, in the 19th century, then came to occupy the same territory that was occupied by the Dutch, and then later on abolished slavery in the world. And then as a result, then those descendants of the Dutch settlers engaged in what is known as the Great Trek or the Great Journey of invading South Africa. And in all the movements, when they were moving from the Cape Side inland, they met residents and occupiers of the land who were African people. They fought and defeated all of them because they had military superiority. They had guns, and our people were fighting against colonial invasion through like the basic weapons of spears and knobkerries and basic things and basic shields that can only allow for a physical one-to-one confrontation. Then in the entire invasion, all our battles, like almost all our battles, we as the Africans were defeated because these ones who were invading had military superiority, and then they had the backing of their mother countries in terms of the supply of armaments and guns and everything else then. And in that process, there was then beginning to be state formation in South Africa, the capitalist state formation in South Africa. They began to organize themselves into recognized state entities with administration and tax collections, initially amongst themselves only. In the Cape, they officially established the Cape as a province which had authority over everyone else whom they had said stays in that particular area. And throughout, like the 1700s, the 1800s, they were the most brutal of the period. And the context of the brutality of the 1800s is because there was discovery of diamonds and this discovery of gold in the 1800s. And then the colonial invasion became much more vicious against our people. Everywhere where black people coexisted with white people, they were made to be subjugate, to be lesser people, to be ruled by the white colonial settlers. Now, there's an important thing that happened in 1894. So you'll realize that the major issue was the disposition of the land and disposition of the animals as well, like the livestock. So the cattle, when they take the land, they used to take livestock. For instance, from Dlambe, they took more than 25,000 cattle. Then they went to fight with Makanda. They fought with almost all the establishment of black people in South Africa, and they defeated all of us. So the defeat is reality. It's not fictional. It's not an idiom. It's not some proverbial defeat. It was a physical defeat where we would fight, but we were defeated because the colonial invaders had military superiority all over us. And then after the discovery of diamonds, we'll talk about that in a different presentation. The discovery of diamonds in Kimberley, and then the discovery of gold in the Witwatersrand, which is now Johannesburg. Then they realized that the Africans who are existing in this geopolitical territory called South Africa today are able to live their lives without depending on wages. They don't need to work. They don't need any money. They don't need any salaries because they've got their own farms, they've got their own land, they've got their own cattle, they've got their own sheep, they've got their own goods. They can self-sustain outside of the colonial system of resource distribution. And then in 1894, they passed something called the Glen Grey Act. It was supported by Cecil John Rhodes. So Glen Grey refers, it was an area like, which was called the Glen Grey. Glen Grey is currently the areas of Queenstown, Komani, and Lady Frere. So then that Glen Grey Act, which was passed in 1894, was to then introduce taxation on Africans, to say that all Africans that had occupied land must be given some title over that land, but must now be compelled to pay taxes for that land to the colonial government. What was the purpose of that? Was to force black people to wage labor. And then a lot of people were then forced from their land to go and work in the mines because they had to pay taxes to the colonial government. They had no other means to survival because when they did not pay tax, they were going to be harassed, their homes will be destroyed, their cattle will be dispossessed, everything else, the little which they had, was going to be taken away by the colonial government. And to force everyone else into wage labor, they then passed that Glen Grey Act as a way of coercing our people to go and work for the emerging capitalist establishment and system in South Africa, which in the beginning our people are not interested in. Now, from 1899 to 1902, there was an intra-white war, like it is portrayed as such, like the so-called Anglo-Boer War, where the English were fighting against the Dutch descendants, like called Afrikaners now. They had a war amongst themselves of particularly control of the Orange River colony, which is currently the Free State, and Transvaal, which is the combination of Limpopo, Gauteng, Northwest, and Mpumalanga. Then there was a war, like physical war, that basically defined what should become of South Africa subsequently. And in that war, so it is mischaracterization to just refer to it as the Anglo-Boer War, because it was the South African War. A lot of black people were involved in that war, and a lot of black people lost their lives in that war. And almost all black people who were involved in that war were fighting on the side of the British. And it was not the last time they did so, in fighting on the side of the British. I will explain later on when else did they do so. And then in 1902, there was a truce. There was an agreement between the Boers and the British that they must establish a colonial government that excludes all black people. Then they signed something called the Treaty of Vereeniging. And so during that period, these areas were now declared to be under British colonial rule because of the defeat of the Afrikaners in the so-called Anglo-Boer War, which is the South African War. And then the entirety of the Cape, Natal, Orange River Colony, Transvaal Colony, which was called the South African Republic, they were all under the colonial rule of Britain because the British won the war in the intra-white war, which had a lot of black casualties in the manner in which it became to be. And it is important to highlight that from the late 1800s and the early 1900s, the form of resistance of black people was beginning to take organizational forms in these colonies. So the congresses that began to emerge, the Cape Congress, the Natal Congress, the Transvaal Congress, began to emerge as organized formations against colonialism, against the colonial laws. So black people began to say that we have been defeated in the physical war. Now let us try to appeal for the moral consciousness of the colonial invaders. Maybe they will hear us if we sound like them, if we adapt their principles and everything else. I will explain the context of that later on. And then from 1908 to 1909, there was a national convention of delegates from the 4 provinces: Cape, Natal, Orange River, Transvaal. White male only. 33 delegates had a conference from 1908 to 1909. You know, these conferences that take people's land, they tend to take long, because even the 1884 conference to scramble Africa happened from 1884 to 1885. We're going to have a historical brief about that some other day. And then that conference then resolved on the formation of the Union of South Africa to combine the 4 provinces into one unitary state, but had compromises that the legislature must be in Cape Town, that Gauteng or the Transvaal must host the administrative capital, and that the judicial capital must be in the Orange River Colony, which is Bloemfontein, and then that the Natal will get in the deal making a completion of a railway project which they were busy with at that particular time. And then the Union of South Africa was a result of whites who had fought amongst themselves, had a truce, but historically had jointly defeated African people. Then they said, let us form a unitary government called South Africa. They were called the Union of South Africa. And because these 4 were the colonial territories, they then had to go and pass the Union Act in 1909. It was actually promulgated in 1909 and then later on launched in 1910. And that act had to be passed by the British Parliament. So in the British statutes, the laws there, they've got a law called the Union of South Africa, which basically gave the foundation of the political territory we call South Africa today. So it was a white-only creation which excluded black people. And throughout that period, the black leaders were trying to resist. And it is important to make a highlight of one major resistance that happened, which was not a middle-class resistance, which was not an elite resistance, was the resistance by Bambata, because when Bambata was one of the chiefs under the kingdom of the Zulu, and in opposition to the taxes that were being imposed on African people, Bambata went to battle. He went to fight physically against the colonial administrators, but they came in very heavy on him, captured him, and killed him and beheaded him. To behead is to cut off a person's head, and then they want to display that, no, we've killed one of these rebels. They were now demonstrating that as the colonial forces, they have a superiority militarily over our people. Then the other forms of resistance, as I said earlier, was the beginning of the congresses that were beginning to be formed in the different provinces. And then in 1909, these congresses, I want to explain that context so that you understand all of us clearly. They then had a meeting in Bloemfontein, the first meeting, to then talk about formation of a national congress which will unite all the forces that were fighting against colonialism. Now, but before I get there, I want to give an interesting context about what happened. So the Union of South Africa is formed amidst objections by these congresses in the provinces. All of them sent petitions that you cannot exclude us, please involve us as black people, you know, like, please, they were begging, like, they were literally on their knees. You must read the transcripts of the letters and the submissions that they were making. They were begging the colonial governments and settlers to say, please include us in the 1910 arrangements. They wrote to the Imperial Parliament, they did everything else, but they still did not succeed in terms of that the whites went ahead to form a government of their own which excluded black people in decision-making structures. And fast forward, and then in 1913, they then passed the Native Land Act. The Native Land Act, so you know it because it is passed in 1913, the processes of engaging on the Native Land Act began in 1912. And then it was passed in 1913. And amongst some of the things the Native Land Act says is a native shall not enter into any agreement or transaction for the purchase, hire, or other acquisition from a person other than a native of any such land or of any right thereto, interest therein, or servitude therefore. That is what the Native Land Act said, that black people are not allowed to purchase land from any other person or to even hire or to utilize land from other people except from the natives, except from black people again. Now, this is interesting because the Native Land Act gave 7% of the land to the black majority and Africans in particular. So white people, so the population of white people in 1913 was about 350,000 whites who were in South Africa. And then they gave themselves 93% of the land. And black people were more than 5 million people, and they were given 7% of the land through legislation. But this is something very interesting to observe, that the 1913 Land Act was not the beginning of the land disposition. It was the institutionalization of land disposition. So the land had already been taken from our people in all the colonies. And there was not yet a national legislation that institutionalized, that legislated that disposition. So 1913 Land Act was the institutionalization of the disposition, and then had specific references to the fact that our people must have access to only 7% of the land. And what was the resistance movement saying? You know that 1910, then there was a formation in 1912 of the South African Natives National Congress, which is currently called the ANC. It is not fallacy, comrades, that at formation, the SANNC was about pleading for accommodation in the colonial table. It was not anti-colonial. The ANC at formation, the South African Natives National Congress at formation, was not an anti-colonial movement. It was about fighting for the inclusion of the black elite on the colonial table, to say, no, just involve some of us who have got education, who have got some property, and then we'll participate in that particular platform. And I want to bring you to the attention of I want to bring you to the attention to the first petition which was sent by a delegation that was sent to Britain to oppose the Native Land Act. The delegation was John Dube, the first president of the ANC, Its Secretary General, Sol Plaatje, was there. Mapikela, at whose house the first conference of the ANC happened. Sol Msane was part of that delegation that went to Britain to oppose the 1913 Land Act. So you must get a book. There's a book which I will get a copy of now. It's called From Protest to Progress. I'll get to that book, but one of the things that the official document of the ANC said is that the natives of South Africa are loyal subjects of His Majesty the King, but they have no voice in the Legislative Council of the country. And then it further said that the petitioners are Your Majesty's most loyal and humble subjects, who have always been loyal to Your Majesty's throne and person, and still desire to continue being loyal to Your Majesty's throne and person. These are official documents of the South African Natives National Congress, which basically was saying, we can't fight against the colonial establishment. Let us just beg for some participation there. Just involve us, and not all of us who are like almost civilized black people. And then of course, you would think that there are times where they would say something that sounded radical. So someone who says that from the beginning the ANC was an anti-colonial movement is not telling the truth. It was not. It was pro-colonialism. They had accepted the defeat. They were now begging for participation in that particular platform. And what illustrates this? So, in 1914, they went to Britain, to the king, to beg. They were rejected. They were not even given any recognition. And then in 1918, they went back. So, you must understand that period. So, 1914 to 1918 is the period of the World War. And in another document which they were making as a petition again, then they said that we offered 5,000 strong men to go and fight the Germans in Southwest Africa. But we regret to say that the offer was refused by His Excellency the Governor General and ministers of the Union of South Africa on the ground that it was a war that is waged amongst white people only. But then the document says that, but we later sent 17,000 to German West Africa, which is current-day Namibia, and 25,000 went to fight in Europe as laborers. So we are loyal to the throne, the king's throne. These are official documents of the SANC, the foundation of the ANC, which was basically saying to the king, the crown in Britain, that they want to fight on the side of Britain in the World War. They even sacrificed the lives of black people. You would know, all of you, after the First World War, of SS mainly, the ship that got to kill 615 of the soldiers, black soldiers, who were fighting a world war which had nothing to do with them. And that happened with the endorsement of the SANC. And we have not diverted from the land question. We just want to illustrate what was the attitude of those whose land was taken away from. The kings, the chiefs, they resisted. They did everything in their power. They fought. Sekhukhune fought. Chulabisiu fought. Mushweshwe fought. Everyone else fought. In all parts. In Natal, there was a huge resistance. Dingaan fought. Hintsa fought. All the Makanda fought. Dlambe fought. All of them fought vociferously against colonial invasion. But when these congresses were beginning to emerge and want to fight against colonialism or fight against land invasion, they fully acknowledged and legitimated the colonial government. So, like in the other organization, they say they've had, I think it's 54 conferences now. So if you go and check the first 30 conferences, they were all addressed by the colonial government. Like the colonial government will go and attend the conference and say, no, we're listening to you guys, you can continue. It was not a threat to colonialism. And of course, that changed after the formation of the Congress Youth League in 1944, and then in the 1949 conference of now the then ANC. And the inspiration which we must now speak to, which we draw as the economic freedom fighters, it is that generation that said no to colonialism. We must fight for total emancipation. We must fight for freedom. So the slogan of the founding generation of the Congress Youth League in 1944 was freedom in our lifetime. They say that they're going to fight for freedom in our lifetime. So that is where this thing comes from. And who were those people? It was Anton Lembede, it was Congress Mbata, Mxolisi Majumbuzi, Robert Risha, Nelson Mandela, Oliver Tambo, Walter Sisulu, and all those militant, William Nkomo. They fought, they said that they're going to attain freedom in their lifetime, in the manner in which it is. And that is the generation that then radicalized the struggles of black people, the resistance against colonialism and apartheid. Those are the people who said we must take the regime full on. And the regime was not so threatened because they were so used that no, these ones of the SANC and the ANC, they're very collaborative. Like the only one who almost they couldn't have never agreed with was their fourth president, J.T. Gumede. But the manner in which it is that the resistance of black people under the ideological and political guidance of the SANC did not have the struggles of black people and Africans in particular. They were just mediators. They were just fulfilling what they said in their founding principles, their founding constitutional principles, that they are going to mediate between black people and white people. But in reality, in the first years before 1944, they were not a revolutionary representation of the suffering, of the landlessness of our people. And that history is very important to tell, because a wrong presentation is given of history, that the resistance against apartheid only came from the Congress movement, which is not true. So there was a time where the black consciousness movement was much more dominant in the resistance against apartheid than the Congress movement was. And in most instances, including 1976, the Congress movement condemned the actions of the young people who rose against apartheid. There was a time where the Industrial and Commercial Union, which was predominantly black, was more dominant. There was a time where the young lions, of course, there's a claim that they were linked to the Congress movement, were much more dominant than the organized formations of the Congress movement. So we need to read history properly so that we understand where we come from. There was a time where the Pan-Africanist Congress in the late 1950s and early 1960s was much more dominant in the resistance against apartheid. So a presentation that suggests that from 1912 until 1994, the only resistance to apartheid dominantly was the ANC, it's a misrepresentation of history in terms of what it is. It is not the alpha and omega of the struggles of our people. That is what we should contextualize. So comrades, the question has to be answered. Where were our leaders when our land was being taken? What were they doing? And this is the question which is going to be asked to all of us, as well as the current generation of economic freedom fighters, with a generational commitment to economic freedom in our lifetime. They are going to ask, where were you when they were selling off key sectors of the economy in the state? Where were you when they were privatizing ESCOM? Where were you when they were privatizing SAA? Where were you when they were weakening the capacity of the state to help our people? In 100 years' time, the generations that will come will be making that analysis of all of us who are alive today, that where were you when the call for land expropriation without compensation happened? That question is going to arise, all of us. That is why we are now going back to say, what did John Dube do? What did Mahato Sifako do? What was his expression? Sifako Mahato sounded radical, but he also acknowledged the legitimacy of the colonial government. Z.R. Mahabane, J.T. Gumede, Pixley Seme, initially progressive, but later on extremely reactionary. What were their positions? Where were the leaders of black people when the landlessness was being imposed on the black and African majority? And that is the question that is arising. And we pose it because history will also judge all of us who are at the forefront and in the generation that is fighting for economic freedom in our lifetime. And now, after they had conquered the state and had conquered all of us, constituted a union government, they then passed a lot of laws that got to subjugate our people to further subjugation. So 1913, 7% of the land is given to black people. And then in 1936, they amend the same legislation and say, no, let us add maybe another 6% to make it 13% because it looks like they won't work. In the 7%, it won't work. There are too many. Let us maybe just add 13%. And that is when what happened. 1936, the land becomes allocated to black people was 13%. Now, what? Let me just give quick highlights in terms of our ideological tools of analysis. We have already presented the presentations on Marx, on Lenin, and Fanon. And Marx and Engels in the Communist Manifesto, when they are analyzing the 10 demands of all progressive workers' movements and working class communist movements in the world, as part of the key demands that must define all of these progressive working class formations against capitalism, they say that this is general applicable, and it may not be applicable to some of the countries, but abolition of property in land and application of all rents to land to public purposes. That is what it says in the Communist Manifesto. You must read it. It even says combination of agriculture with manufacturing industries, gradual abolition of all the distinction between town and country by a more equitable distribution of the population of the country. So combine agriculture and factories. I think that it almost speaks to the pillar that speaks about decentralized development and our policy on land. That is in the Communist Manifesto. Now we must go and read a perspective on Lenin called the Peasant Mandate on the Land. First, when this socialist Great October Revolution happened, the slogan was peace, land, and bread for all. Peace, land, and bread. That is the slogan that drove the socialist forces in Russia to overthrow the Tsar. So land has always been at the center of socialist struggles. So anyone who wants to suggest that land is not a critical component of the land struggles completely misses the point, because even in the socialist Russia and the peace context was because there was still the World War ongoing from 1914 to 1918. And then the land question was at the center of that struggle. But in the Peasant Mandate on the Land, Lenin says private ownership of land shall be abolished forever. Land shall not be sold, purchased, leased, mortgaged, or otherwise alienated. All land, whether state, crown, monastery, church, factory, entailed, private, public, peasant, shall be confiscated without compensation and become the property of the whole people. That is what the Peasant Mandate on Land says. That is what the Peasant Mandate on Land says. And so it sounds very clearly familiar with what the economic freedom fighters says. I'm going there now in terms of what is the position of the EFF. I already have started with Fanon. Fanon says, for a colonized people, the most essential value, because the most concrete, is first and foremost the land. The land which will bring them bread and above all dignity. So the land is at the center of our struggles. That is why it is cardinal pillar number 1. What is the EFF position on the land question? The founding manifesto of the EFF in paragraph 39 says, the EFF's approach to land expropriation without compensation is that all land should be transferred to the ownership and custodianship of the state in a similar way that all mineral and petroleum resources were transferred to the ownership and custodianship of the state through the Minerals and Petroleum Resources Development Act of 2002. So, comrades, there's no mistake. The familiarity of the EFF's land expropriation without compensation principle to the peasant mandate on land, it's there. It's very clear in terms of what we stand for. And why do we say that the state must be the custodian of all land? It's because we have made a legitimate, scientific, proper political, ideological observation that the piece-by-piece redistribution of land doesn't and will never work. Do you know, since 1992, when the ruling party adopted the Ready to Govern, in 1994, they had said that they are going to redistribute 30% of the land by 1999. And when President Mbeki became a president in 1999, he shifted the goalpost to 2014 to say 30% of the land, of arable land, will have been redistributed, will have been bought from the white colonial settlers, who took the land through violent disposition. Then they said, no, we must buy back that land. Then they say that by 2014, we should have only redistributed 30% of the land. It has not happened. It's 2020 now. And less than 10% of the land has been given back to our people. What does that mean? It's 25 years to redistribute just 10% of the land. So to do 20%, you need 50 years. To do 30%, you need 75 years. To do 40%, which will be inadequate, by the way, you need 100 years. This is what this government has been saying should be done. So the EFF says that, you know, when you look at the map of South Africa, the whole of South Africa, we must say that it's under the custodianship of the state so that we can redistribute the land equitably to all who need it. And what will be the key components of such a redistribution to all the people? One is that it is going to represent the demographics of South Africa in terms of land ownership. Because black people are 80% of the population in South Africa, they must own 80% of the land. So the redistribution of land must mirror the demographic representation of South Africa. That is what we stand for. But two, we must guarantee security of tenure for those that are going to be given land, so that it is not open to abuse by administrators of the state that, no, I've given you this land, now we're changing our mind, it must be given to someone else tomorrow. So we must guarantee security of tenure for particularly residential land allocation, and even for agricultural purposes. That if you are using it, there must be security of tenure in terms of how that should be handled. And then in terms of the agrarian reform, there must be strategic, proper support to all those who are involved in the production and processing of food. The entire food value chain must be given support. And in this context, the food chain of food must involve the manufacturing of tractors and everything else. Scientific research and investment must be made on seed. Everything else must be controlled and must be supported by the state, so that we were able to deal with this question appropriately. And at the end as well, the state must utilize its purchasing power. The procurement power of the state must be utilized to buy all the agricultural products, because the state is the biggest consumer of food, a single consumer of food in the entire value chain, because the state has to buy food for food parcels that are being distributed, for school feeding schemes, for hospitals, for prisons, for a variety of other functions. So that is one of the things that in terms of agrarian reform must be dealt with. So the EFF position on the land question is that it must be given to the custodianship of the state, because when you do piece by piece redistribution, it doesn't work. It will lock us into landlessness for a longer period of time. I want to give a clearer context of how that custodianship is going to work, so that all of us are on the same page. Now, comrades, this geopolitical territory called South Africa today is 1.2 million square kilometers. 1.2 million square kilometers. That is 122 million hectares. So the land surface of South Africa is 122 million hectares. So under apartheid, the Bantustans constituted like 16 million hectares. So that was the 13%. Currently, government has got direct ownership of 17 million hectares. Majority of it is the former Bantustans and the South African national parks. So the South African national parks owns Kruger National Park and a variety of other national parks, including the Table Mountain National Park. It's owned by the South African National Park. I think in totality they've got about 2 million hectares of land. They've got actually 4 million hectares of land. Kruger National Park only is 2 million hectares. So South Africa's land surface is 122 million hectares, and still 79% of that land surface is owned by private individuals who are white. And the black people own nothing. Own insignificant numbers, because a component is owned by the white people, a component by the state, and a small portion by black people. So black people who do not own the land, and this is scientifically proven. You must go and check the report of the Surveyor General on land in terms of the racial distribution of land across all the people. Now, there's an interesting aspect about this. As part of the land which the state owns are special economic zones. So the special economic zone in Kucha, in East London, in Dube Trade Port, in Atlantis, in Musina now recently, in Komati Port, in Mpumalanga, in Harrismith, there's a transport SEZ there. All of that land is owned by the state. And I'm highlighting this because that is where majority of physical foreign direct investment is happening. So anyone who suggests that investment will not happen because the state owns the land is daydreaming. It's not being scientific. Majority of investments in South Africa happen on state-owned land. And those who invest are given security of tenure. That is what we should, all of us, appreciate. But also a bigger component of the forestries, like where these companies are growing those long trees, majority of that land is owned by the state. And those companies are given leases to utilize that land. The Department of Public Works and a variety of other departments own land. And they always give access for usage by other people for a variety of purposes. So a notion that says that once the state is under the custodianship of the land, it means people will not gain access of the land, is absolutely nonsense. So we need to have one state custodianship of the land, and then we must then have a land redistribution philosophy and law that says that this is how we give land to our people on an equal basis. But how do we get there? We need to amend Section 25 of the Constitution. We need to amend Section 25 of the Constitution, which currently says that, look, you know, it's one of the legislations, one of the constitutional clauses That is very problematic. I want to give you a correct and verbatim read on it. The current constitution, it says, no one may be deprived of property except in terms of law of general application, and no law may permit arbitrary deprivation of property. So it's a constitutional clause that states by saying no one must be deprived of property, and that was the way to protect the interest of the white landowners. So what Section 25 does, it takes 1913, which is institutionalization of the colonial dispossession that happened before, and now make it a post-democratic pillar. Constitution adopted in 1996 that says that don't touch the unequal property relations without compensation. You must pay for that if you are going to do so. And then it says property may be expropriated only in terms of law of general application for a public purpose or in the public interest. And then it says that subject to compensation. That is what the current constitution says. Subject to compensation, the amount of which and the time and manner of payment of which have either been agreed to by those affected or decided approved by a court. That is what we're living with, of a constitution that has institutionalized the inequalities, the landlessness of our people, by saying that if you want to take charge, if you want to take back the land, you must compensate those that have gained it through colonial means. That is what the law says in terms of what happens. And you must get a full copy of that. Now the EFF says the new constitution, the amendments which we have proposed, says must read as follows. It says that we must remove that thing of no one in section 1 to 25(1) and say that the state, including parliament, executive, and judiciary, carry an obligation to redress imbalances of the past through enactment of laws that will achieve redress and equitable redistribute all its resources. And then it says, we must then in section 2 says, property may be expropriated without compensation, only in terms of law of general application and for a public purpose and in the public interest. And then we say that we must remove the current subsection 3 and replace it with the state should be custodian of all South Africa's natural resources, inclusive of land, mineral resources, and water, and relevant legislation should be passed to clearly define and contextualize state custodianship of natural resources. That is what we say should be the new amendments, and then we'll then remove the part that speaks about 1913 in the Act. That is what we say in our official submissions. But where are we now, comrades, in terms of this process? You would know that on the 27th of February 2018, the Commander-in-Chief and President of the EFF led a motion in Parliament, which was adopted to then set a process on what should happen in South Africa's expropriation of land without compensation. Now, that is what happened. Now, that parliamentary resolution, which was led by the Commander-in-Chief and President of the EFF, mandated Parliament to do two things. It said, number one, review and amend Section 25 of the Constitution to make it possible for the state to expropriate land in the public interest without compensation, and in the process conduct public hearings to get the views of ordinary South Africans, policymakers, civil society organizations, and academics about the necessity of and mechanisms for expropriating land without compensation. And then it then said further that propose the necessary constitutional amendments with regards to the kind of future land tenure regime needed, taking into account the necessity of the state being custodian of all South Africa's land. So a lot of people think that what the Constitutional Review Committee and the Ad hoc Committee has been dealing with is just the expropriation part without the issue of land tenure and the one of custodianship. That is what Parliament said we should do through the motion that was led by the EFF President and Commander-in-Chief, Julius Malema. And you will know that in the 5th Parliament, there were processes to consult people in communities, and submissions were made in Parliament, and currently there is an ad hoc committee that is looking into how the wording should be on the expropriation of land without compensation. That is how it is in terms of this a particular process. Now, there's a lot of questions that have been sent by a variety of comrades, because the questions are similar and they've been sent by so many people. The question that is there, one is, when we give state custodianship, like if we then effect state custodianship, are we going to take people's houses? The answer is no. We're not going to take people's houses. We'll convert the current land ownership tenure into a tenure that guarantees that you are occupying that particular land for residential purposes, for this particular purpose. But we know that once we have done so, there will be a lot of land that will be available for our people, because there must be limitations on the amount of land each individual can own. Currently, you have got white people who own land parcels that are bigger than other countries. Like, they are bigger than countries, like smaller countries in Europe. There are people who own land parcels that are bigger than communities, like huge communities. And our people do not have access to land. But we're not going to dispossess people of their houses. It is not in the policy of the EFF to do so. We're going to have a new regime of state custodianship with guaranteed security of tenure. The other question, a broad question that arises, is what do we do if the constitution is not amended in the manner in which it is, in the manner in which we aspire it to be? You will remember that the first National People's Assembly of the EFF took a resolution that, as part of our struggles and campaign programs on the land question, we should lead our communities on land occupation, particularly of unoccupied land, for residential purposes. We did not say for agricultural purposes yet. It's a resolution of conference that said that we must engage in land occupation. And land occupation is not happening for the first time. It has been part of black people's existence throughout history. And the most interesting land occupation program, which we spoke about when we were launching the land occupation program in Moidrai in Metsimaholo municipality, which was led by the courageous fighters of the EFF there. We then gave an example of the present day Orlando, like Orlando in Johannesburg. So Orlando was established because of land occupation, which was led by James Mpanza, James Sofasoke Mpanza. So the Johannesburg region of the EFF, they refer to themselves as James Sofasoke Mpanza region. And there's no policy in the EFF to name regions, but they refer to themselves as such. So Orlando was established because of land occupation. That is why James Mpanza is called Magebula. And he is the one who founded the Orlando Happy Boys Football Club. The Orlando Happy Boys Football Club is what later on became the Orlando Pirates Football Club. That is why Orlando Pirates Football Club is called Ezika Magebula. They are referring to James Mpanza. Magebula is James Mpanza. So James Mpanza, Ezika Magebula, or Gebula umklabak amaspalangenka. It comes out of that. So the founder of Orlando Pirates was a leader of land occupation struggles and there's a township which is possibly one of the most celebrated townships in Africa and possibly in the world because of Vilakazi Street, where is the Nobel laureates recipients resided. Desmond Tutu stayed there, Nelson Mandela stayed there, Walter Sisulu stayed in Orlando, and a variety of our leaders in the resistance against apartheid stayed there. And that place was established because of a land occupation program. So the land occupation program is a program of the economic freedom fighters. So we are going to continue to fight for the constitution to be amended so that we can expropriate land, all South Africa's land without compensation for equal redistribution, provide agrarian reform support, but in the immediate we're engaged in land occupation struggles. That is what defines our struggles in the current context, and we do not postpone that for posterity. There are actually a lot of areas. We must give due to all the fighters in different parts of Gauteng, in the Free State, in Mpumalanga, who have led land occupation programs, because we are a revolutionary movement that appreciates that in the immediate we must engage in all these programs. Now, lastly, comrades, is that all of these things require us to take political power. We have to take political power. As we said in the last presentation, the road to political power is 1, strong organization, 2, the ability to mobilize the masses, then we'll take political power. Because it is that political power that is going to give back our land to all of us in a legislated, in a process that will involve the constitution. You see, these apartheid and colonial invaders, they fought physical wars, and once they defeated us, they then utilized the political power through passing of legislation to condemn us to 7% of the land. So we must use legislation to have the same impact, but on the negative to what apartheid did. We must use political power. We need to have a strong organization of disciplined fighters, of disciplined cadres on the ground. And then we then build a strong movement that mobilizes the masses to take political power. We need to take political power so that we can then take back our land, take the economy, and then redistribute it to all the people. I had said in the video which was earlier presented that we're going to talk about the land question in Lesotho, in Botswana, in Namibia, in Swaziland, in Tanzania, in Zambia, and Zimbabwe, and almost all parts of the Southern Africa. I think what we need to do, because this lockdown is extended now, the coronavirus lockdown, we should have a separate presentation on the land question in the African continent. And starting from the colonial invasions of all African countries, and also mentioning of the 1884 conference in Berlin, which subdivided Africa amongst colonial powers. You know, the king of Belgium that time, called Leopold, said that they are meeting. When he opened the conference, he said that we are meeting here and we are going to subdivide this magnificent cake of Africa amongst ourselves. So we must give a proper historical account of why and how the entirety of the African continent was colonized, and how all civilizations in the entire African continent were destroyed by colonial invaders, including in Mapungubia and Tulamela, in Egypt, the Great Mali, and in Sudan. We must be able to contextualize where our struggles come from. But that will require a separate presentation so that we're able to then deal with all of these issues. Comrades, let us continue to engage. Let us engage in these platforms. Let us ask questions where we don't understand. I think we have tried to capture the essence of what the EFF's land policy is all about. And although we were telegrammatic in terms of presentation of history, there's a lot of things that we can always highlight out of those things that in the early 1900s, the struggle happened with almost no resistance, because those who were supposed to represent our people thought of the colonial establishment as a legitimate establishment. They were trying to appeal to the moral consciousness of colonial invaders. They begged them. They even donated our people to go and fight in white people's wars. And that is where we are now. It looks like the genes of this SANNC have not changed, because this is exactly what we are confronted with in today's parliament. But we have to fight on until we achieve victory. We must fight on to say that our land must come back. Maibuye Africa is the late. Thank you.